For everyone with an interest in NASH or more broadly fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 4, Episode 17 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Our third birthday celebration starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
So, downloaders, listeners, and friends, welcome to our third birthday party. This is going to be a very long episode, possibly the longest one yet, and certainly the longest one yet without an extra-sode. Before I see the final edits, the previous record with an extra-sode was over 2 hours, slightly over 2 hours, and that also included a full day of coverage from virtual AASLD meeting in 2020. Why is this so long? Well, we're going to intersperse a full episode with our four leading surfer hosts, Louise, Jörn, Stephen, and me, with an interview with our other lead surfer, Donna Cryer, and two more with executives from two of our birthday sponsors, Amy Articolo from Novo Nordisk, who's already been a guest on this podcast, and Frédéric, CEO of Inventiva Pharma, who listeners will meet for the first time in this episode. Also, we will include recordings from a few key earlier moments during the first year of our podcast, starting with this one, our kickoff from episode 1. Remember this sound?
Drug developers, investors, researchers, and corporate executives wrestle weekly to understand what is happening in commercial development of NASH medications. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Stephen Harrison, star equity analyst Yasmin Rahimi, C-suite veteran Peter Traber, and forecasting and pricing guru Roger Green as they discuss the issues affecting the evolving NASH market from their own unique perspectives on this week's edition of Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Nine surfers, 60 guests, and 188 original episodes later, we start our fourth year on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Join hepatology researchers and key opinion leaders Dr. Stephen Harrison and Professor Jörn Schattenberg, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and their guests, Global Liver Institute founder and CEO Donna Cryer, Novo Nordisk Senior Medical Director and Liver Unit Lead Amy Articolo, and Inventiva Pharma CEO Frédéric Cren, as they celebrate 3 years of the podcast, this week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
It wouldn't be an episode of Surfing NASH if on a day where we made lots of plans, lots of things went a little bit crazy. So we'll have Jörn with us in a few minutes. He's in Copenhagen trying to get back to his hotel right now. We do have Stephen with us, and Stephen actually showed up ahead of Jörn, which is not the typical pattern. But Stephen, great to see you. How have you been?
Hey, Roger. I've been doing well. Good to be back for today.
Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about what you've been up to recently? Because there's been plenty, yeah?
Yeah, still working hard to leave that big fat dent on the planet in the name of fatty liver. So my work hasn't stopped, kind of focused on really changing the way that we enroll NASH clinical trials by eliminating the pitfalls, roadblocks, hurdles for drug development, and doing that through work both at my Pinnacle site network as well as my Summit Clinical Research Integrated Research Organization, where we work very closely with big and small pharma to smooth out clinical trial enrollments, making it easier for studies to be enrolled, working on screen fail rates, and to that end, focusing diligently on efforts with AI digital pathology to bridge the gap between ordinal path reading and non-invasive testing reading. So I think in that vein, we've made a lot of progress, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about that today. And then where we are with the non-invasive test and really focusing on three major platforms, Litmus, Goldmine, and Nail NIT, and how those three can work symbiotically with the Nimble platform to drive the paradigm forward on diagnosis, monitoring response to therapy, and predicting long-term outcomes using our non-invasive testing strategy, whether that's sequential testing like the guidance documents have, or simply finding a better test that could be used singularly to identify and monitor and predict response is where we want to go. So lots of work being done all across the board. As you know, we have lots of drugs showing promise in late phase 2 development and now in phase 3. So continuing to drive that paradigm forward, working with our regulatory authorities to smooth out how we enroll these trials, what endpoints look like. And I guess that's enough to keep me busy for a day.
Stephen, with all that going on, do you have any spare time? time to have anything that's fun in your life right now?
The fun in my life is watching my kids grow up. So I'm currently in Dallas visiting my daughter at Southern Methodist University, where she's completing her sophomore year. And then my son is in his senior year at Texas A&M, so he's finishing up there, and just kind of trying to continue to be a dad to them and mentor them in their path towards greatness is something I treasure and enjoy doing. So that's my hobbies, if you will, or just kind of the free time I have focused on family where I have the time to do that.
Okay, excellent. And good to have you with us. And happy birthday, everybody. Louise, welcome back.
Thank you.
Last I caught up with you, you had a meter of snow in 7 days and were in a remote enough part of British Columbia that you couldn't make a connection to come on the podcast last week. So you and I tried for about a half hour.
Which is surprising, given it was Whistler. And we're supposed to have good technology there. They did do the Olympic Games after all, but no, I survived in one piece. Enjoyed a wonderful family holiday. And that sounds strange, but my husband flew in from Perth, Australia. I flew in with two of the children from London, and the eldest child with his fiancée flew in from London on the flight before we flew in from London. So get the coordination to get the entire family together from different locations in the world, and then we all flew out of Vancouver within hours of each other to 3 locations again.
So everybody went back to from whence they came, huh?
Yes, they did. So it was great, but it was great for the first time in a couple of years, and certainly pre-COVID, to have gone back to Whistler to get some quality skiing in. But yeah, they've just closed Whistler Mountain after nearly a metre of snow in 7 days. But it was wonderful. But I was struck by listening to the podcast last week, and my vision of you in a rabbit suit for playing the Easter Bunny sort of struck me as something from one of the movies that Julia Roberts and Dolly Parton did, where there's an Easter Bunny in it. Steel Magnolias, that's it.
Steel Magnolias, there you go.
Brilliant film. If anybody's never seen it, watch it.
I've seen the play, not the movie.
Yeah, what you just said about the movie, the quotes from the movie is very interesting to me. My daughter asked me about a quote, and I have my favorite John Wick quote. If you haven't seen John Wick, the 4th episode just came out, and to me, it's the best one of them all. But, it's apropos for this conversation because I haven't been on the podcast in a while, and I'm back today. And so if Roger were to ask me, are you back? Would you say you're back? My answer would be, in John Wick style, yeah, I'm thinking I'm back.
I'm thinking you are back. I think that's great. So if we're doing movie quotes for just a minute, to give Jörn another second to get here, I did every week Turns does this podcast club that they started doing during the pandemic with our podcast and still does them. They invited Jeff McIntyre and me to join them last week to talk about the episode we did on the ISA report. And for whatever reason, at the end of that episode, Diana Chung and Pam Danaher, and people on podcasts don't know Diana, but you do know Pam. She's been on a couple of times. And I wound up talking about movie quotes. And Stephen, we wound up back at Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which I would think would be a favorite of yours.
That's a favorite. Yeah. Okay. Which quote did you use?
Actually, I started with swim hell, the fall alone will probably kill you. And from there, I wound up on what rules in a knife fight, which is actually maybe not my favorite quote, but certainly my favorite scene. My favorite quote might be what came after that nobody ever hears, which is Newman looking, I was just waiting for someone to count to 3, and Redford goes 1, 2, 3, and he hits the guy with a 2-handed back cross and knocks him flat on his back. So with that, happy 3rd birthday. Jörn will be with us in a minute. I wanted to do a couple of things today. One of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to play some audio from key moments in our history. And let me start here. Stephen, this is the beginning, literally the beginning. Hi, this is Roger Green, and welcome to the initial podcast of Surfing the NASH Tsunami, a podcast for people who are involved with drug development and commercialization in the liver disease space. We've developed this podcast because over the last month, we've heard tons of questions from virtually everybody involved in this community about the impact of COVID first, and then how that's going to affect the entire domino chain of upcoming market events, product readouts, clinical trials, launches, all that going forward. We have assembled a panel of 4 people, each of whom is probably the defined expert or one of the top 2 or 3 in one of the areas that is critical to this market. And the way this is going to work is that each week we will have a topic. One of the presenters will start by kicking the topic around, and then folks will react, and then we'll have discussion. That's the entire opener. As you listen to that, that doesn't sound at all like what we wound up doing, say, this week, does it?
Well, it certainly has evolved, but I would say it's evolved in a way to meet the needs of the time. You know, when we first launched, we were the only conduit for information that could be broadly disseminated. We weren't going to meetings. Everybody was stovepiped and siloed in their own academic institution or their own business. And the dissemination broadly of data was lacking. That gave us the opportunity to start the podcast. And certainly it's been, I would say, a huge success in all the feedback that you've received, I've received, and others have received. And we've evolved, you know, to the point where we are today. And it's not by chance and it's not by coincidence. And it's through a lot of hard work and effort. Louise coming on board, Jörn coming on board, you working diligently to provide the content and all the background that makes this happen. And I think the testament of time proves the podcast worth. And it's just something that's been fascinating to watch evolve over the past 3 years.
It's been fun. And we now have Jörn with us. Jörn.
Hi, everyone now. Glad to see you and good to hear you. Hi, Roger. Hi, Stephen. Hi, Louise.
Hi.
Hey, Jörn.
Jörn, it gave everybody a chance to catch up on what Stephen's been doing. And we were just starting to play the intro to the very first episode. We were just actually going with the very first thing that we did right at the beginning. I'm about to give you Stephen's initial intro. But Stephen, a couple of things. First of all, thanks for that. And yeah, this has been a labor of love by a lot of people, the people up front, and also our engineer, Mike Wilson, who's been with us since about episode 15, and Eric Rounds and Steve Vennon, who've been providing background in terms of social media and marketing from the beginning, and Jake Norman, our associate producer, who joined us a year ago. Stephen, one of the things I remembered when I listened to that is that we originally just planned for the four of us to keep rotating topics, and Peter wasn't worried because he figured we couldn't go for more than 3 months and then we'd be done anyway. And the other thing was that we talked about this being targeted at the drug development community, and it's really gotten a lot broader than that, you know, in terms of who listens right now. The growing listener base is increasingly treaters, transplant hepatologists, but also doctors in all different realms or allied professionals who are interested. And even Louise, the frequent nurse, because Louise's nursing episodes have actually wound up being among the bigger hits that we've had.
And the liver nurse. I remember you poked a melon with what was it, to reproduce a liver biopsy?
We poked a grapefruit with a biopsy needle.
Stephen, I don't think you were on when we talked about this. Do you know the story?
I thought it was urban legend.
This is how Quentin and I got the first FibroScan at Imperial. We had no coronaries in the room of the 80-year-old lovely League of Friends, but Quentin was doing a wonderful presentation and I'd seen it before we went in. And I said, Quentin, we need something. He said, what do we need? I said, trust me, we need something. I said, I'll be back in a few minutes. So I came back with a grapefruit and he said, what are you going to do with that grapefruit? So he was doing his presentation and we were talking about liver biopsies, all the statistics, all the bits and pieces, massive boardroom, big table. The average age of the table was probably in their 60s because they hold the funds and they're all wonderfully diligent in donating their time to these charities. They weren't quite sure what he was talking about. So I said, well, we take it from this, and I ram this 6-inch needle through the grapefruit, and you know a grapefruit crackles as it goes through the skin, just like it does through the skin. And everybody at the table went, and we've changed it to that. We had the money for our FibroScan in that second. The difference between something academic and something just practical. And the two married together for a perfect resolution. Imperial got its first of 5 FibroScans.
That actually is one of the great stories of this podcast. A more serious story than Neil Henderson's Gold Lame Shorts or my bunny suit, but I think really compelling. So the other thing I'll do real quickly, Stephen, is let me play another piece of tape, which is you introducing yourself to everybody.
Stephen Harrison. I am a gastroenterologist and hepatologist in San Antonio, Texas. And I focus my energies these days on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in 3 main areas. One, epidemiology, helping to define the prevalence of this disease and the severity of the disease here in Texas predominantly. And then also non-invasive testing. I work with the Litmus Consortium and run the Work Package 5, which is focused on imaging non-invasive testing for NASH. And then finally, I work at Pinnacle Clinical Research, where I have a site focused on NASH clinical trial enrollment. And then I run a site network called Summit Clinical Research as well. Happy to be a part of this terrific group of people to debate and talk about the current issues in NASH, particularly as it relates to the virus at present. In the field of NASH, the past year has been kind of a daunting year, to say the least. And I've been on the front end of some negative clinical data relative to NASH it's refreshing to finally get some positive news. Actually, several bits of positive news recently with several different companies pressing positive results, most recently with Articolo showing positive data, and being the PI on that study is an honor for sure.
So that was 3 years ago, Guy.
And I'm still grinding it out, doing the same type of work, but more and more positive data continue to come forth. And, that I believe that data that we talked about with the Articolo back then was the Balance trial. And since then, the Harmony trial is read out. And soon we'll have data from the Symmetry trial in F4 patients. And of course, along the way, we've had the Madrigal data readout on multiple phase 3s, or at least 2 big phase 3s, Maestro-NAFLD-1 and Maestro-NASH, and a covey of additional positive data sets from other smaller biotech companies in phase 2A and 2B. And I think, there's a lot of positive momentum. I know we're going to talk about where we've come in the past 3 years, and I'll save a little bit of my gunpowder for that, but good times.
Yeah. I agree. Just to everybody keep in mind, that was April 2020 when we launched, and Stephen said that. GenFit had not yet released their non-response results from phase 3 of elafibranor, and we thought that OCA looked promising at the FDA. In fact, the first 3 months of this podcast were about an awful lot of downers all at the same time on that front, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Louise, do you recall the circumstances around your first appearance here?
Yeah, I recall we met via LinkedIn, I think. I think just going back to the recording you showed at the first episode, I got into the first episode and then caught up on the 4, but enjoyed every one of them. And it wasn't because I was any one of the target audience that was named in that initial launch, but that I was somebody who was interested in liver field and advancing my knowledge and looking at NASH and NAFLD, which was taking over from viral hepatitis, which was my previous strength, and the majority of the patients that we saw at Imperial and within our research unit, and we were now doing more and more clinical trials. And I think we had a lot of screen failures. There were reasons to look to try and improve these. And of course it was COVID. So COVID was just hitting, and so therefore I'm not the only nurse, I'm sure, that's been hooked from the beginning. And I enjoyed the banter that went on between the 4 of you, Stephen and Peter, and some agreed, some didn't agree. But that's actually what a good conversation's about, challenging perspectives. And I think listening to the Stephen's intro, he's gone on from strength to strength. We now, as we discussed, have Nailine IT, which has come out of that last section of what you were saying there about your interest in non-invasive technologies and driving that. So I think it still applies today, but with bigger halos and bigger strengths around it. But I think I was just being a little bit the gobby nurse from London in liver and fighting for patients at that stage, and that's how we hooked up. And I got strong-armed into this.
Well, yes. Actually, the first great example of improv in the history of this podcast is it's a half an hour before episode 4, and I get a call from Yasmin saying she can't do the podcast anymore. And I rack my brains for who do we know that can come on a half hour's notice and do the podcast. And I rolled the dice and reached out to you, and you were available. We had no time to do an intro for you. This was your intro. As we get started, a couple of things are different and a lot of things are the same. We are without Yasmin today. She was unable to join us. Fortunately, we have an excellent guest sitting in with us, Louise Campbell. Louise is a patient advocate and a nurse activist based mostly in London, a couple of other places. She'll talk about that. And among her other honors was selected as the Hepatology Nurse of the Year in 2018 by the British Journal of Nursing. As a patient advocate, Louise's perspective is likely to be different than Yaz's as an investor or an analyst, but equally valuable in its own right, and we're really excited to have her with us. Good afternoon, Louise.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be invited, and thank you very much.
And then we just went on. And that was episode 4. And then we'll just lurch forward a little bit to the last day of EASL 2020, which was the first virtual conference we ever did. And Stephen, you suggested that we might have Jörn join us.
Thanks, Roger, and sorry for getting ahead of you there. My name is Jörn Schattenberg. I'm the director of the Metabolic Liver Research Center in Mainz, that's in Germany, and located in Germany. And I'm a gastroenterologist, hepatologist with a special interest on the studying of pathophysiological mechanisms of patients with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the development of novel diagnostic and prognostic tools, I think, and therapy, of course. And I'd really like to, thank you for inviting me to this very special and interesting podcast here. Happy to serve with you guys this afternoon.
And let me just add, Roger, in addition to being a world-renowned hepatologist,
with a multifaceted focus across a wide range of liver disease. He's tied for probably one of the top nicest hepatologists on the planet with Jean-Francois Dufour. So hats off to you, Jörn. Thanks for joining us today.
It does include you talking about how accomplished he was and saying that he's also the nicest guy in hepatology. And that was Jörn.
Ever since he's been a wee bairn, he's been super nice.
Yeah, he has, although your partner in crime, Dr. Nuruddin, has given him a different look of Jörn, which people have commented on.
What's the Syrian viewpoint?
Well, he's American adopted, so he compares to actors.
He has described Jörn as the Matt Damon of hepatology.
It's better to be the Matt Damon of hepatology than the John Wick of hepatology.
As long as you blow away fibrosis, it works, I guess. Yeah. I don't remember exactly. I remember the quote, and I guess there is a good thing of being called a nice guy, but you can also just be the nice guy and nothing else. So, but I know how Stephen meant it. So thank you for that, Stephen. And thank you for introducing me.
Yeah, you're welcome. The only other person I've ever kind of had a comparison to would be Quentin Anstey. And I always call him the Thomas Jefferson of hepatology. He's like the elder statesman, the guy that politically knows everything, the right thing to say and when to say it.
Mm-hmm. He's better spoken, and his English expressions, I think we learned from him a lot, right?
No, that's true.
I have to tell you, Jörn, from the first time you came on, every episode you did produced really high ratings. And it wasn't high ratings in Germany, only in Germany, although we did a little better in Germany when you were on, but it was high ratings everywhere.
Well, I remember getting to the podcast through looking for some interpretation of the FDA complete response letter. And then I'm not sure, I must have Googled it, and then I caught Stephen's name in some recording, and I think this was it. So this is how I got to know the podcast.
Well, we're glad you got here.
Yeah, we certainly are. Stephen, that particular episode, the FDA complete response letter, has been cited by people as the strongest emotion demonstrated yet on a podcast episode 3.5 years later, if you recall. And I think, frankly, the one time we ever put anything on air that turned out to be dead wrong.
Really?
Well, if you recall, we had a regulatory consultant on who suggested that the FDA might decide that they were going to do away with accelerated approval and conditional endpoints and look only to outcomes. And if you recall, you responded appropriately.
Yeah, well, there's certain things that generate a visceral response from me, and that individual had a unique way of pulling that out. Maybe that was, did you stage that, Roger?
No, I didn't. And in fact, Donna who recommended him in the first place, has apologized to me 2 or 3 times subsequently, although I don't know that she's ever apologized to you.
And none needed. I mean, at the end of the day, everybody's entitled to their opinion, and some are more right than others.
And it made for a great episode, by the way. I mean, people just sat back and went, whoa.
Well, that's true. There's stuff that's made for television, and there's stuff that's made for podcast, and that made for good podcast fodder.
So we did that. And then we've just kind of gone on. I mean, in the run-in to ILC that year, we announced that Louise and Donna were going to be joining us as full-time hosts. Although sadly, it was a little too much of a grind for Donna's schedule, or it proved over out the next 3 months. And then we've just kind of gone forward from there. First, I promised this week I would announce our new permanent surfing lineup. Let me congratulate Louise Campbell on getting her own surfboard and being invited to hang out with the rest of us on a regular weekly basis as a permanent surfer. Louise, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure, as always.
And a pleasure to have you with us. Now, I would like to introduce, I gave a hint on this last week when I said reintroduce, our new permanent surfer. Donna Cryer, the president and CEO of the Global Liver Institute, who joined us for the International NASH Day episode, will be coming aboard now as a permanent surfer. Donna, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, or whatever time our listeners are experiencing this.
It's true. It's afternoon here as we're taping, but we have no knowledge where it is at the moment you're listening. At this exact moment as we tape, it's something like 2 o'clock in the morning in India. So Donna, do us all a favor, take a couple of minutes and tell folks about yourself.
First of all, it is an honor to be included in this group. I've enjoyed the many, I guess this is the 16th provocative and informative conversation on the ever-evolving ecosystem in non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or NASH. So I am a patient advocate, and leader of a patient advocacy organization. So the triple threat, I had my first diagnosis when I was 13. 19 and a liver transplant by the time I was in my 20s. So at this point, I have lived more of my life as a patient than not, and even more of it as a liver transplant recipient than with original parts. Being able to establish and scale the Global Liver Institute to meet the myriad needs in liver health, the myriad needs of liver patients around the world, is really a humbling obligation and a privilege.
So let's step out of the podcast and step into life in liver space, okay? Stephen, from where we were standing in 2020, asking you first, what's happened in the last 3 years that you wouldn't have expected? And what's happened that you would have expected?
For me, I just jotted down a couple things today that I thought were at least important in my mind that have evolved over the past 36 months. Number one would be advancement of our understanding of the non-invasive technologies and the diagnostic algorithms that have reached alignment by multiple different societies, whether it's ACE, EASL, AASLD, AGA. We all kind of come to an agreement that sequential testing provides the optimal diagnostic ability for both primary care and endocrine and gastroenterologists to identify the at-risk patients that are most worthy of further workup and potentially treatment. And these algorithms, quite frankly, have done more than people think they've done. As we move towards drug approval, the payers are going to want to look towards a way to identify these at-risk NASH patients, as they are likely to go PA to label on the indication, meaning whatever the FDA allows in the label, these payers are going to go prior auth to that label. Now, the next question everybody asks is a liver biopsy going to be required? And one of the things that I can clearly say has become evident over the past 3 years, and maybe more over the past 5 years, is we don't do liver biopsies for the clinical diagnosis of NASH anymore. I mean, I can count on one hand the number of biopsies I've done this past year. None of them are for the diagnosis of NASH. They're all for a diagnostic dilemma or a situation where I've known two different liver diseases in the same patient, and I need to target which disease is worthy of the treatment, right? Is it cholestatic disease and NASH, and which one is a bigger player? Bruce Bacon taught me that a long time ago. He said, if you have multiple diseases, you don't necessarily need to treat all of them at the same time. Go after the one that's causing the most trouble first. And for a lot of us, that was hepatitis C. We eradicated it, we got it out of the way, and then we could focus on the next thing that was bothering the patient. But, diagnostic dilemmas are really the main reason. Drug-induced liver disease is another one, or multiple diseases in the same patient. And so once that point was made clear, the payer said, okay, well, what kind of test do we fall back on? We will follow the KOL's advice on how to diagnose these patients. And lo and behold, we have 4 guidance documents that say essentially the same thing. So there is a roadmap to get people to therapy once that therapy is approved and ready to go without going through a biopsy. Now, while that advancement has been terrific, it's certainly left the door wide open for ways to improve on that. It's still a blunt instrument. It's just developing muscle memory, as Ken Kuzi will say, to get the message out to those people on the front lines to help them identify these at-risk patients. But we are leaving many behind that will eventually need treatment, and that opens the door for better second, third, and fourth generation biomarkers that can improve on the precision and accuracy. And my analogy to this is another military analogy. We would often use 8-digit grid coordinates to train artillery fire on a location. With an 8-digit grid coordinate, I can get within 10 meters of your location. And we see that being unfolded in the Ukraine right now with our targeted HIMARS precision guided munitions. So in NASH, we don't have an 8-digit grid coordinate to diagnose the disease, but we're getting better at it. And this would be work that's done on the epigenetic platform and lots of other platforms that are going to be able to refine and define exactly the type of patient that needs to be treated. So we've come a long way. We have a long way to go. I tell people every day, I'm like an orange construction cone. I'm not where I used to be. I'm not where I want to be. I'm a work in progress. I'm under construction. And I would say that's exactly what's happening in the biomarker field. Number 2, we have an understanding of the limitations of pathology and how to improve using things like AI digital pathology. That's really come to the forefront. I'm excited about EASL. We're going to hear a lot more about AI digital pathology and how that interplay of unmasking truth relative to drug development may interact and allow us to take the next step with regulatory authorities on modifying our Subpart H approvable endpoint. And number 3, new targets. My goodness, we've had a wealth of information on new targets. When we first started this conversation, the FGF21 field was just coming into play. We had a couple near misses, if you will, with pegbelfermin. Some issues came up around developing tachyphylaxis. Since then, we've had great readouts from efruxifermin, which is a covalently bonded FGF21, and then pegozafermin, which is a glycopegylated FGF21. And there really are great data coming out of that. The THR beta class with resmetirom reporting out 2 phase 3s, Maestro-NAFLD-1, telling us that this drug is safe and well tolerated, moves the non-invasive test in a very meaningful way. Data on 180 cirrhotic patients, again, treated for 1 year, showing safe and movements in a positive way on non-invasive tests, not one but many. And then the Maestro-NASH trial reading out positive for both NASH and fibrosis, and even a 2-point improvement in fibrosis. So I think really all we could have hoped for there. And then the story with the GLP-1s. I mean, we hear this all the time now. There's this huge onslaught of information about treating obesity and diabetes with GLP-1 and GLP-1 analogs, and they are here. We're using them in clinical practice. I use them in clinical practice. They will be meaningful and helpful in our NASH patients, but it's not going to be one size fits all. There's going to be a need for THR betas, for FGF21s, for combination therapies, on and on and on. So progress made, still more to come. And then a couple more points. The discussion on nomenclature that has been led by Phil Newsom and Mary Ranella has been an eye-opener for me in the field as far as what needs to happen to begin to target the right name for this disease. It's very heterogeneous, and really understanding the foundation of naming diseases. I've learned a lot there, and I've been amazed at how there's been major disagreement on what fatty liver should be called, both from a patient perspective and from a provider perspective. One thing it's done is it's united us on disease awareness campaigns and beginning to get the word out about fatty liver disease in whatever form or notion that we want to call it. And then finally, the tsunami has been a huge player in the past 36 months, in my mind, for disseminating information about this disease and how we're doing as far as non-invasive tests, how we're doing as far as drug development. And then finally, there's been a big clarity around phase 3 development plans. What does it take to get a drug approved? Remember, when we started the podcast, it was one trial for Subpart H and then extend that trial out for outcomes. And we now see the Regenerate trial moving into its 10th year now. It won't be long until we're 10 years there. So the first patient was enrolled in 2016, I believe. Now it's 2023. I mean, 7 years into this, it's likely to be 10 years before that study reads out its outcome data. So we had to pivot, because if you got a drug coming to market that's going to be approved, patients aren't going to want to be subjected to placebo for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, right? So now we have this optionality to enroll a parallel F4 trial in well-compensated cirrhotics and follow them through. But that opens itself up to questioning about, if you don't study it in phase 2, do you really want to take a leap of faith in phase 3 and look at your drug, and does it prevent progression of disease? And then we also need to find the Goldilocks patient in that trial, the one that's just right? You don't want to take a person that's so early they're not going to progress in 2 to 3 years. And you don't want to take a patient that's so far gone that your drug doesn't have any chance of being successful, and you won't show a difference between placebo and drug. So I think we've come a tremendous way, but like anything else, a good experiment opens up lots of new questions that need to be addressed. We've come a long way. We have a long way to go. We are that orange construction cone, but it's good news of great joy for all people relative to NASH in our society today.
That was a rather remarkable answer, Stephen. Thank you.
I fully agree. And I work in the field and know a lot of the details behind it, but I'm impressed by Stephen's oversight and, the comprehensiveness of summarizing that. And thanks for that, Stephen. My take on this is a little bit more, I think, from the academic side. Even on that end, I think there's a lot of excitement. I mean, there's a New England Journal paper published last year detailing the natural history from the large NIMBLE consortium led by Arun Sanyal. And I mean, that speaks to itself. The amount of evidence we're generating, even outside of clinical trials, we've been seeing these patients for a long time, couldn't offer anything. We enrolled them in cohort studies. There's the EU Litmus project, and there are follow-up projects we're talking about now, screening of the population in a research setting. So I think the field, accelerated by the opportunities that have been generated through drug companies, but also academia, is still ongoing. And that's the very exciting news for me here as an academic clinician in this.
So, Louise, what's yours?
I have to say I agree with the guys on everything on there, but I'll be a little bit more succinct. I think for me, the disappointment was obviously OCA not getting approval from the FDA or in that letter. And I think, yes, I wasn't on the episode that you discussed, but I did listen to that episode. The passion was clear. And I think the disappointment when we did do the episode with Donna and what it could mean for patients and that disappointment and how it might affect the clinical trials and people not wanting to participate, I think was well mitigated for following that. So although that was a negative, it has led to where we are coming from today. Better approvals, improved drugs, more information on OCA, and very few trials have a 10-year timeline to be able to look at those sort of side effects. I think also for me, it's about getting the information out there. I've seen the strength that Donna and other patient advocates that we've had on the programme bring, and how that movement and patients are becoming involved in the clinical trial process, not only as purely the participants, but also to assist in the design, to assist in the dissemination, and to be real movers and shakers in that field. And I think for any area of disease investigation, that is something to be applauded, particularly because we're in the liver field. Also for me, having more nurses and more people look at allied health as conduits to the information, and also that we can deal with the information that we discuss on this podcast, and it's relevant to our practice. It's relevant to our education because it will come into a conversation, even if it's only a snippet in a more lay interpretation. I do not come from a highly academic background, but I'm able to translate very well high volume, high details from academic studies into a way that's pertinent and implementable and understandable for patients, relatives from any background and educational level. That is the skill that we look at when we talk about targeting allied health and nurses specifically who are going to integrate and be the front of our sort of dissemination of these drugs to those patients. So to be able to get that voice out there and to try and use me as a conduit to get their voice in here, then I think I've enjoyed being party to that. And also I get letters that say you're in my head when I go on my walk about what would Louise think about this. I have apologised to that person for being in their head for a start. But these are people within the industry, not only now looking at a purely medical, scientific, but actually the humanistic side and the behavioural side to what it means after we get through the clinical trial. Where can we implement that now within the clinical trial to prove that data? That's what I've enjoyed being part of, and throwing the odd curveball in every now and again. I remember the episode when Stephen and I discussed NAFLD to MAFLD, and I said sometimes you need a sledgehammer to open a nut. You just have to do it. It may not be touchy-feely, but it's come a long way since that was even going to the nomenclature discussions because of Asia Pacific. I'd like to think that a lot of what we do here, as Stephen has said, is enable delivery to different audiences of where we are. But I wonder where that field would be without surfing the NASH tsunami, and how much information spread and excitement there would be within the field and the topic, and how people would get to know, because we're unique. our merry band of actors, actresses, and warriors.
Yeah, it's a little different. It's a little different. Someone wrote me a note the other day that said this was the best podcast anywhere in medicine. I don't listen to all of them, so I couldn't comment on that. First of all, I'm happy to tell you that nobody has told me that I'm in their head. I hear that about people think like Louise, they think like Stephen, they think like Jörn. Nobody thinks like me, and I think that's probably a good thing. But I will tell you this, in 2020, Stephen, NASH Tech, if I remember right after you presented the Davison paper, we had a brief conversation at Podium where I alluded to the idea that people didn't know enough yet to know really where this issue was. That the Davison paper was the first proof of how bad biopsy was, right? We've had others subsequently. But this whole thing feels so much richer now, so much more nuanced, so much deeper. In fact, one of the two runner-up favorite Stephen phrases was about we are the Wright brothers and we need to be fifth generation strike fighters. And then today you came up with 8 digits. Can you repeat that, please, so I can write it down so I can have it for the future?
Which one is that?
How we're targeting in the Ukraine.
8-digit grid coordinate. Yeah.
Thank you. I need to write that down so I have it. Actually, in your comment, you also hit the other runner-up in the Stephen drinking game contest, which was about being a work in progress. And the winner, your winner, as compared to Louise's winner, which is you also, was about is the juice worth the squeeze, is the view worth the climb, all those various trade-off metaphors, right?
Sure.
Because I think it's probably the best and most practical question anybody gets to ask. To me, I mean, first of all, 3 years ago, I knew nothing about any of this, and now I know a little.
I think we could all say that.
I think that's right. And I think I knew less then, and I know less now, and I'm not saying that with any sense of defensiveness or apology. I think sometimes coming without a perspective helps. But I think you're right. It has gotten so much, every element of this has gotten so much richer. We spend about, every 5th or 6th podcast in some way, shape, or form talking about clinical care pathways and how are we actually going to treat patients and making all this practical. The phrase that I like most coming out of my mouth, although I've been using it a lot recently, comes from Scott Friedman's comment about the yoke of biopsy that I think that I've described as the straitjacket of biopsy, which Donna, bless her, Cryer, says she liked better because biopsy is truly psychotic. But I think when you get away from AI, I think AI has real value. But in so many ways, our view of this disease and how it gets treated and what is success winds up being governed by conditional approval biopsy scores that we're going to spend years unpacking how to rethink some of these issues in the absence of that stuff.
And, to the FDA and the EMA's credit, they're forcing that thought process. It's not going to just come with the idea of the day and have that pivot. Come with data, not just one data set, multiple data sets, not in just Caucasians, but in Hispanics and Asians and everybody else, not just in non-diabetics, but in diabetics, not for just one therapeutic area, but multiple different therapeutic areas, not just for one agent, but combination agent. It's a very thoughtful and deliberate process, and I have to give them credit for that. At the same time, we want to work side by side with them to generate the data we need to answer the questions that need to be answered so that we can pivot to something different that makes more sense. That's, at the end of the day, this is all about patient care. If we're hindering development because we have an archaic tool, and I don't want to say archaic to imply that biopsies aren't important, but we do know the limitations of these biopsies, and there are drugs that could be incredibly helpful in subsets of patients that maybe when you look at them at broad strokes, the signal doesn't rise above the noise as measured by an ordinal score, but yet in very specific subsets of patients, they could be super additive to a backbone therapy. But those drugs were killed because of the blunt instrument we use as an endpoint definition. So I'm a big advocate for having potentially different endpoints for different targets, looking at different outcomes. And I'm a big advocate for combining MACE with MALO. In other words, combining cardiac events with liver events and renal events. I'm a big advocate for having more than one division of the FDA at the table for an end of phase 2 meeting, having cardiorenal, metabolic, and division of hepatology nutrition, breaking down stovepipes and combining endpoints, to me, is the wave of the future, because the ideal NASH drug is not just myopic and fixes the liver. It works on glycemic control and atherogenic lipids and weight, and it does that in a way that not only do we have beneficial impact on the liver and on the heart, but also extrahepatic malignancy, the top 3 killers of a patient with NASH. So I could go on and on about my soapbox.
Well, something that came to my mind when Stephen said that. I mean, we don't have the optimal tool to identify the patient yet, but we're clearly, through the phase 3 trials, the data we're accumulating and the biomarker programs that are run in there, we're accumulating that data. And if I think of myself and my patient as a treater, I would want the patient to be safe in a disease that in most cases is slowly progressive. So I think there won't be like the tsunami of treatments right in the start. I think we'll start slowly. We'll phenotype the patients and we'll kind of wage in there together and see, do I have a safe compound? Is this the right patient? And then prescribe the drug. I agree with Stephen, it's safety. And then it comes up to, if I'm not convinced, I'm not going to do a biopsy. How is the non-invasive test reacting? Is there additional benefit for the patient in terms of glucose control or lowering lipids or something? And I think that's how we're going to start the treatment here once we get the drugs approved. I don't think everybody's going to go crazy and put everybody on drug that has fatty liver disease. I think for the treaters, at least as far as I see the field, are very aware of the potential weakness of the current identification, the tools, let's say the tools, and we're slowly working our way forward here. So I see the responsibilities being taken up by the physicians to do this safely and identify the right patients. I think many more data will come out once we get the final reports of the large phase 3 trials.
And I think Jörn's got a great point there on the fact that I think it's Quentin that said, when we're talking about all of these euphemisms, it's the fact that perfection is the enemy of good when we talk about liver biopsy. But we're never going to get the perfect tool because we don't have the perfect patient. Every single patient has a different reason for being there and a different set of circumstances. The heterogeneity of NAFLD and NASH is probably beyond doubt the biggest heterogeneity of any disease profile, because you could remove one factor and improve their liver significantly. You could remove the same factor and reduce it in somebody else and have no effect. So we're trying to find the needle in the haystack for the needle in the haystack. That's really, really difficult to do. And a liver biopsy doesn't account in any way, shape or form for each of those different types. It's a pure generalization. So perfection is the enemy of good on a lot of areas. Was it Scott or was it somebody else said that any other disease would be looking really happily at success rates of 89% and things for diagnostics? And yet we're considering those not high enough. Like the guys have said, we're never going to find the perfect tool or the perfect solution, but we need to find something that has that broad range that targets, and then you can get your laser fighter in certain areas for different, because everybody's going to need something slightly different, even with drugs approved in a very broad range.
That makes tremendous sense to me, Louise and Jörn, but if I put on a commercial forecaster hat, which occasionally I still do, I wind up where Stephen was, which is if you take a look at MACE and mallow and kidney and obesity, and you go back to the idea, again, a Harrisonism of the liver is the canary in the coal mine. The liver is the canary for all that stuff. And when we think about commercialization, educating healthcare professionals, these diseases will increasingly fold back on themselves. Understanding fatty liver is the piece that helps the connectivity between a lot of these other things where it was easier to identify what you're treating, HbA1c, for example, but the connectivity between the diseases wasn't necessarily what they are. When you put the liver in the middle of it, the connectivity becomes a lot better, which means we ask primary care to look at each of these things with all the others in mind. And it becomes a very, very different, at the same time that we're looking for better solutions for each possible liver outcome, we're also looking at that in the context of everything that plays out from the liver. I think some of the challenges are really going to be fascinating. But when you look at, I mean, Stephen, you wind up on GLP-1s, right? Go past that to the dual glucagon and the triple glucagon agents, right? And that's a big whack of a lot of things at once.
But you come back to poor liver health being the solution and also the target very early in life. If we keep people's livers healthy, we should see the reduction in MACE. We should see all of the other areas reduce. So it is, I agree with Stephen, I'm a liver health advocate in that way. Let's find poor liver health early to stop liver disease, but also to stop the other interconnected conditions, either secondary or primary, that come from poor liver health. For me, and I think for most of us here, it is the biggest potential target to turn around public health in any country, and particularly low socioeconomic countries where you don't want to have expensive medications because you're not going to get them. You don't want to have liver biopsies because it threatens the life of somebody who is the primary breadwinner in an area where they don't have the care for liver biopsy. So non-invasive technologies, as Stephen and Litmus and Goldmine and Nail NIT improve, it actually has the mass potential to improve the outcomes of liver health in those countries least able to be able to afford these medications coming. So it is it is the canary in the coal mine. And we have seen, obviously, that American Heart add liver disease and liver and NAFLD and NASH to its guidelines and recommendations anyway. And the Diabetes Association add it to its standards of care. So that canary is becoming a little bit more chirpy in its cage, and we're getting there.
And a much bigger canary, I might add. Let me do this. We're getting towards the top of the hour. So first of all, I'll talk about all the contest results after you guys are off air, just so that we can move ahead. Let's do this closing question. Take as much time as you need with the answer. It's the Ides of April 2026. It is the 6th anniversary episode of NASH Tsunami, probably with a new host, but we'll worry about that in 3 years. What will we be talking about then, and what will have transpired intervening 3 years to get us to that point?
So let me start. I think in 3 years, we're going to be more intensively discussing the NAFLD referral pathways and how to apply that drug, the diagnostics, how to implement that in clinical trial. It's going to be the bread and butter on how do I treat the sick liver of the patient that has myocardial infarction and the combination of aspects in these patients. So I think that will become increasingly available. And us as the hepatologists, we're going to be able to inform the physicians on whether this is an at-risk liver disease patient and we recommend the approved drug, or kind of pull out and say, well, you look for the metabolic comorbidities first and don't worry so much about the liver. So I think there's going to be that segmentation of at-risk patients and the recommendation for treatment for whatever's available at that time. And how do we treat these patients together? I think this is going to be an important discussion.
I'm just going to be real provocative. I think in 3 years, you think about what drugs potentially will be approved. Could be obeticholic acid, could be resmetirom. Beyond that, at 3 years, I'm not sure there's another drug that's made it through Subpart H and has filed and has been reviewed and has been approved by 2026. So I think you'll see broad adoption if both drugs are approved. You'll see adoption of both drugs, but there will be some clarity around where both of those are going to be used. And I guarantee you there will be studies where both of them are used together. Kind of in investigational studies. Perhaps we're going to hear from the DUET trial with Terns, which is combining an FXR with a THR beta. So you'll have a phase 2 trial with both. And then I think if that's positive and both drugs get approved, it's going to be interesting to see what combination therapy looks like on label and off label. The other thing is I think where we'll see the biggest advancement is in the non-invasive testing field. And I think we'll see big advances in AI digital pathology. It could be that PathAI has AIM-NASH approved as a drug development tool through the biomarker qualification program. That could enact sweeping changes in the way that Subpart H is addressed. And I think we'll have more precise and accurate NITs using lipidomics, proteomics, epigenetics, methylated DNA, combinations of those. I think we'll be better at finding the right patients. But at the same time, I think in 2026, there will be a ton to talk about that we have not yet figured out. Imagine what we do today with hepatitis C. We're talking about eradication, elimination strategies. But at the same time, we have patients, I just saw one 2 weeks ago, that has failed Epclusa and Mavyret. So they're out there. How do we manage the failures? How do we manage those that we still can't find? What are we going to do with the people that get treated with obeticholic acid and resmetirom but still have advancing disease? How are we going to manage those people? What kind of tools do we need in our toolbox to identify the patients that are not going to respond to therapy and identify those that are rapid progressors? I still think we haven't answered that well. So there will be as many questions in 2026 as there are today, just a different flavor.
Makes sense. So the one question I have, and this isn't an answer, I'm not a scientist, it turns out that one of the two nominees for my most frequent stated is that my last natural science course was high school biology, so I'll say that again at this moment, is if in fact our perspective on how all the metabolic diseases fit start to fold in on each other, then approved or unapproved, I suspect that the GLP-1s and the dual agonists, there already be one of those on the market and maybe more by then, whatever their indications are, will have more of a role to play earlier in the disease progression, and therefore, Louise, whether indicated or not, more about liver health than about liver disease. But I wonder if that starts to slow the rate at which the disease grows, at least in the advanced economies.
It could. But remember from the Hep C world, how many people you needed to treat and cure before you left that big fat dent on the planet in the name of liver transplant regression, in the name of decompensating disease prevention. You had to climb the mountain to around 60-70% of patients being treated and cured, maybe even higher than that, before you began to see a drop-off. So while the GLP-1s, the GIPs, the GLPs, the glucagon agonists, all of those have a special role to play and are no doubt impactful. There are three different types of patients. There are those that get it and respond. There are those that get it and can't tolerate it. And there are those that have no access to that therapy and can't afford it.
Right.
And to come back to the example of Hep C, right? We have a tremendously effective drug, but the challenge is to identify the patients. And that's what I meant. We're going to sit down and define the referral pathways and how to identify them. The same holds true for advanced or pre-cirrhotic NASH, right? If we can hit a lot of people with fatty liver with GLP-1s, those are not the cases that will prevent transplantation, HCC, and decompensation. We need to identify those that are on the highway to, cirrhosis and decompensation. And that's the challenge. It's so closely linked to the biomarker. And again, I do see so many developments here from academia and the clinical trial space. So that's really the challenge.
And all that makes sense. So what year was the first DAA approved for Hep C?
You're not talking about the boceprevir and the talopavir. You're talking about Harvoni.
Harvoni, right. When was that approved? About 10 years ago, maybe?
2014, we got access in the UK, so it would have been 2012, 2013.
9 years. Okay.
Sounds about right, yeah.
By that standard, we haven't even hit year 1 in fatty liver disease.
No, and the concerning thing about that is we've had access for 9 years, certainly in the UK. We are still using nurse specialists to deliver those treatments and specialised doctors. It has not been rained down to primary care as a one tablet once a day. We'll see you in 6, 8, 12 weeks, which is what was discussed. So that brings me to my thing of what we're going to be discussing in 3 years. We're going to be discussing the lack of education out to tertiary areas, nurse specialists in multi-comorbidity settings to be able to deliver these medications, because there is not a chance of every hepatologist in the world purely managing all of these medications, resmetirom and obeticholic acid, if there are only those two medications available on top of the GLP-1s in obesity, weight loss and those areas. So we do have a growing need to get that education program started now, because if we're never going to release these patients to primary care once we've got them, then we have a problem. Then my other comment was on what Stephen was saying, is we're going to see a wealth of data for non-invasive technology. I think if we use what could potentially be happening in the UK, with the government announcing significant promotion of FibroScan into over 100 integrated care areas throughout the UK in the next 2 years, I would expect a minimum of 10,000 scans to be done by each of those units. Coordinating those results and being able to see what the bio data tells us on every single one of those real world people, so that we can really strengthen the biomarkers that are showing us the data. So collecting that data from the real world people before it, and not just NAFLD and NASH, but multiple comorbid liver conditions, hepatitis C with NAFLD, HIV co-infection. So BASH, ASH, all of these multi-different liver health issues that we've got, we are about to release an awful lot of real world data from the UK, and that needs to be managed very, very well, or we're going to lose it. And I think that, for me, as Stephen's rightly said, we are going to strengthen non-invasive technologies and really get to the information, but we're also going to be able to find a lot more people with poor liver health and liver disease. And I think what we will be missing is the data from the GLP-1 use of semaglutide in clinics that aren't doing anything but biomarkers for liver disease. But we are going to see an awful lot more liver cancer in those populations as we start to work through them. So I think we will be talking about non-invasive technologies that increase cancer rates, but also increase detection in the next 3 years, and education.
So if this is just one podcast, it might go 3 hours a week, huh? So Stephen, John Wick, let me let you have the last word. First of all, now that you're back, we'd love to have you back again soon. You and friends have put together 2 fantastic papers recently on clinical trial issues. I'd love to put an episode on that and maybe a couple of other things, but take the last word for today.
Promise, hope. I think that's what I take away from 3 years of podcasting and the next 3 years. And again, like I said, maybe our mascot should be the orange construction cone, because we are are not where we used to be, and we are not where we want to be. And this podcast is the conduit to deliver the information that's being generated and help frame the discussion on where we should go from here. So if you're a listener, thank you. If you want to have things discussed that we haven't discussed, please let Roger know, and we can try to build that into the content. And just a special thanks to Louise and Jörn and you for leading the charge on this podcast, and that, it didn't go away after 12 episodes, and it's continued now for 180, 85 or 86 or something like that.
Today is 186. Yeah, that's right.
186. So
151,000 downloads, 9 hosts, 60 guests.
Wow. Just impressive statistics, no doubt. So thank you for that. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
And I think that's plenty. We're past the top of the hour. Everyone's been really generous with time today. Jörn, go to bed or on to your next engagement. And Stephen is...
You got a cake.
Yeah.
If you all blow, it'll go out. 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3.
It worked.
Happy birthday, everybody. I'll be back with Business Report in a minute. See you later. Bye-bye now. Thank you.
Take care.
And now, in the order they were recorded, this week's 3 special interviews. First, Louise and Roger speak with Amy Articolo from our sponsor, Novo Nordisk.
Okay, so this morning we are fortunate to be joined by Amy Articolo from Novo Nordisk. Amy, this isn't your first time with us.
No, it is not.
That was a famous and amazingly well-received podcast back at the beginning of 2022 talking about NASH and Nail NIT and all these exciting things in the future. And we've gone another 16 months forward from there. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. How are you?
I'm doing fine, and Louise is with us this morning. Good afternoon, Louise.
Yes, just gone into the afternoon. So
it's the start of the workday in the U.S., or roughly the start of the workday in the U.S., and roughly the start of the afternoon in the U.K., so we're all good. So, Amy, thanks for joining us, and thanks to Novo Nordisk for being one of the sponsors of our 3rd birthday celebration, and to your being available as you come back from vacation to make time in your day, albeit first thing in the morning, to do this conversation. We're glad to have you with us. So, what we were talking about on podcast yesterday, and what we'll be talking about in our interview with you and a couple of others, is where we were 3 years ago when this podcast started, and what's changed since then, and then looking forward 3 years, what we think will happen in the interim. 3 years ago, you weren't even working on NASH personally, were you, at that point in time?
No, you're correct, Roger, and thank you so much for this opportunity to be here. On behalf of Novo Nordisk, we're really super thrilled to be a part of the birthday celebration, so happy birthday to Surfing the NASH Tsunami. As I reflect on 3 years ago, you are correct. I had started out with a focus as the medical director for obesity and NASH because our phase 2 data hadn't been published yet. And so when I think about where we were in 2020 and beyond, we were looking at our data. We were thrilled to see a positive result on NASH resolution of our data and published that in New England Journal of Medicine. And then from there, we were really excited about where our next steps would be. If I take us a step back even more, be into the past, I'd like to say that our endeavors in NASH as a company started out with an independent sponsored study. So it's wonderful partnerships that we have with everyone in this space that we really value because it helps us really drive to meet the needs of the patients. 3 years ago, we were thinking about what the NASH ecosystem looked like and how can we be a partner and with hope and fingers crossed to be a leader as well in this space. I'm just really thrilled to see all of the changes that have occurred that are going to benefit patients in the space. 3 years ago, there was still so many struggles in terms of a therapeutic being available. Liver biopsy was still predominant. Where Novo Nordisk was going to have a role in the NASH space was still to be determined. And so I can say with a lot of happiness that it is really morphed into something truly positive. Relationships are key. Really focusing on patients' unmet needs is going to be key, and really finding what's going to matter in clinical practice. And as everyone knows, an OBGYN and a clinician by heart. So I always think about how that interaction really needs to be optimized so that it benefits patients. And to be able to do that, we really want to think about simplifying that process. And I think 3 years ago, we weren't sure what to do with that. And now 3 years here and 3 years in the future, I think that we see a path forward to make that happen.
So first of all, I should note that when you talk about where your career started, every time I think about you, I get this little thought bubble about going from having delivered 10,000 babies to helping probably billions of people by the time we're done do a better job in their advancing years. You truly embody the whole cradle to grave thing. And to take it one step further, remember 16 years ago when your babies were really little ones, I was talking to Novo Nordisk about how to make sense out of what liraglutide meant, given that GLP-1s were a different cast of characters than anything that had appeared in diabetes or metabolic disease up until that point in time. So it's been a long journey for the company and an interesting ride for you. So when you think about, if you had to pick one or two ahas from the last 3 years, what would they be, do you think?
That's a great question. And from personal experience with working in NASH, I think one of the greatest ahas was the true collaboration that I see with thought leaders, experts, the specialists in really trying to do the right thing for patients. And what I mean by that is that we have a pretty big gap to address in the sense that this is a relatively under and undiagnosed condition compared, let's say, to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and other metabolic type conditions. It's really amazing. And so that was an aha moment that when we think about that gap, and it can seem sometimes to be a really steep climb up a mountain, if you will. For me, the aha moment was we can do this because everyone really is moving in the right direction. All of the experts and thought leaders and the data, our partners in regulatory authority seats, everybody wants to see this happen. So that was, I would say, one of the biggest aha moments, which is really great in this space because it means that we really can do this.
First of all, I can't believe it was 18 months ago since you came on the podcast. Just looking at the Novo space where you've moved to with the GLP-1s, with all of the data and how that's gathering momentum across those fields has been fabulous. One of the things that you touched on there is the collaboration. The collaboration in NASH and NAFLD that Novo bring is this cross-dimensional and cross-speciality strength that you have. You alluded to before with obesity, diabetes, and that. And I think, how do you see that strength that you've got being able to be delivered in NAFLD and NASH as we move forward? Because it's a great skill set to have already in your armory.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we think about that too is, what benefit can we bring from our knowledge, especially in the GLP-1 space? And so we look at our emerging data, right? So what are our clinical trials exploring? We've got some really exciting clinical trials we're going to read out in the next year or two, especially that could touch the NASH patient, particularly looking at our phase 3 data. That trial's ongoing, and our large cardiovascular trial looking at SEMA 2.4. So really excited about that because of the benefit. And then, looking at just across the GLP-1 portfolio, what benefits can we glean? What learnings do we see that is going to benefit patients who struggle with not just NASH, but perhaps diabetes and obesity? Because as you know from the guidelines, the at-risk population typically does have those conditions. So what benefit can we bring, whether it's from our clinical trials or real-world evidence, that is going to be able to demonstrate that impact that's going to continue to move this space forward?
That's interesting. I know we're working together on the Rising Tide series with Novo Nordisk that one of the pivotal issues I think you folks are focusing on maybe more than some other people are primary care and the whole issue of clinical care pathways and how do you take and push back up line to liver health, which is Louise's area of interest as well. So can you comment a little bit on what you envision might happen over the coming 3 years in terms of outreach to a broader medical community to get care to patients earlier in the continuum?
Oh, Roger, now you're speaking to what I call my personal baby and ambition here. So absolutely, I think that the guidelines put a significant stake in the ground at really identifying the opportunities for the non-specialists and specialists to work together, especially with utilizing the non-invasive tests, which it resonates with me when we had a podcast about, let's not call them non-invasive tests, let's just call them NASH tests, because that makes sense, right? We refer to tests that don't require histologic tissue as tests, so why not do that here as well? Because that distinction might make all the difference when it comes to the access perspective. That might be another aha moment.
We had that moment together, you and me. Yeah, go ahead.
That's right. Aha moment number 2. But in terms of care pathways, absolutely, I see the future being a way to optimize through the electronic health record where everyone is in the care continuum, primary care who touches the patient, endocrinologists, OBGYN, specialists who are able to utilize what the evidence-based guidelines demonstrate to follow that algorithm, and then reflexive order sets with reflexive prompts to streamline the process to identify the at-risk patient, diagnose them, and then get them the resources that they so desperately need, which includes confirmatory tests all the way through management. And with treatment therapeutics looming on the horizon, I think that this is going to really have a tremendous uptick. So if I had in 3 years from now, hopefully we're going to have this conversation and say, as you recall, we talked about this and now it's streamlined mainstream care.
I just thought that was a very interesting point. Amy's right. From the sound of it, we have the ability to turn primary care, who tend to refer everything with liver straight to a liver physician, into liver experts, tests that allow them to do that and be comfortable about referral onwards. That just resonates with me, what Amy was saying there, and that skill set and speciality, because I know we've had the conversation in the UK with NICE and with physicians saying, if you only allow specialists to use FibroScan, you're telling primary care they cannot do liver care. That is by far the wrong signal to be sending, because they do liver care very, very well. Sometimes they just don't know how well they do it. So that whole process that Amy described and moving into that way is exactly what she said. We're going to take this, and in 3 years' time, we're going to be turning around and saying every primary care is going, well, we're experts in liver health and care and that prevention. And I think that's the strength of what Novo Nordisk are bringing, and the rising tide, and obviously surfing NASH.
And I think the whole space. Amy, we had two dynamics that came out of our conversation with Jörn and Stephen and Louise and me yesterday. One of them is actually this one, which is the more I listen, the more I believe that all these diseases in the metabolic spectrum are going to fold back on each other. That I'm not sure that what we're going to have 3 years from now are primary care docs who are experts in liver health per se, but they will have a much broader understanding of how all the metabolic pieces go together and the role of liver as canary in the coal mine, and will react accordingly. So they won't be treating cirrhosis any more than they are right now, but they will be able to identify problems earlier and challenges earlier and understand the breadth of the challenge and how to treat it appropriately. On the other hand, Stephen said yesterday, and I'm quoting, this is one of these Stephen, I'm going to be controversial moments, where he said, I'm not sure that we're going to have more than just resmetirom and OCA in 3 years if we have OCA, given the timelines to getting drugs delivered. So I'm wondering the degree to which the pace of drug approval is going to affect the process we're talking about now. I think it will certainly affect what happens in F3, but I'm wondering from your perspective how central, when for exactly what SEMA, for example, were to get approved, how much effect that will have on this meta trend in primary care that we're talking about? Or do you think that's something that's going to develop its own momentum anyway because of diabetes and obesity and kidney and just everything else that's going on?
Yeah, Roger. So 2 comments on that. The first is that I agree that primary care, even if they're not interested in becoming the experts, right? That they just want to be more confident and feel that they've got tools in their toolbox to be able to address these chronic diseases. And wouldn't it be just amazing if the liver disease space helps be that connector of all things chronic disease that impacts, let's say, the various different organs that they take care of already, right? Cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, and now chronic liver disease. So I do see that the guidelines were the first stake in the ground for that. Care pathways, simplifying where to find what resources and how through an automated process is going to help mainstream the care model and allow for, as Louise mentioned, who does what when, who should be referred and when is still going to be there, and appropriately so. But there's going to be that opportunity to really connect all the dots and, to your point, see the metabolic disease as it is in terms of these various different, we call the polychronics, right? The chronicity of disease that can be impacted by therapies that have been explored in different areas. And that's certainly the ambition of Novo Nordisk, to explore these different disease states that the molecule semaglutide can impact, because it can also help reduce polypharmacy, simplify the process for the patient, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of availability, I will have to push back on Stephen. I don't think that there's only going to be 2 in 3 years. I do think that semaglutide will have a significant place in the hearts and minds of being in the toolbox and availability. And the good news is that we have tremendous data that's already in existence. So there's a lot of comfort and confidence in how the trials were conducted, the utilization in real world, and its impact and benefit for patients. So I do think that it's going to have a significant role to help a variety of different patients, depending on where they are in their stage of disease. Thinking about the future, that's our commitment to pipeline, right? We recognize that monotherapy is likely not going to be the answer for all, and that makes sense. So our commitment to exploring combination therapies, what kind of combinations that could really provide mechanistic diversity from a mechanistic perspective, but then also demonstrate the safety and efficacy as well is certainly our commitment. So I think 3+ years from now, there's going to be a significant significantly different field than it is today, and I'm really looking forward to it.
As are we all. So first of all, Amy, in wrapping up this brief interview, I want to note that that's the first time the phrase polychronic has ever made its way to this podcast. It will not be the last. It will not be the last. Louise and I will remind each other to give you appropriate credit when we use it, just so we know who to brand it to, number one. Number two, so thanks for making time this morning. I know you just got back from vacation and you've been scrambling like crazy, so we're really appreciative for you doing this. And congratulations on just a fantastic foray for you personally and the company into fatty liver space. And your enthusiasm and passion are really self-evident, really, every time you speak by the third word. And it's just a great thing to hear. And I think we're fortunate, all of us, to have you with us. So with that, let me say thanks for today.
Thank you.
And we look forward to having you back on the podcast many more times in the future.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Louise. And it's been an honor as always. And, it's just amazing to continue to work with everybody in this space. So really appreciate the offer.
The next special interview is with our fifth surfer, Global Liver Institute founder and CEO Donna Cryer.
So I'm here with erstwhile surfer and GLI founder and CEO Donna Cryer. Donna, great to see you today. How are you doing?
I am doing well. Fun fact, I actually do know how to surf. I learned in Hawaii when I was 13. It did not prepare me in any way for the surfing that we are doing on this podcast, but I just wanted to note that for the record.
Well, but we also know that you do great podcasts. For those of us who watch GLI Live at noon every Wednesday East Coast time. So you can surf and you can podcast. I think you're the whole package. I think you got it all covered.
Thank you.
So we're taking this week to look back 3 years and look forward 3 years. You haven't heard this, but when we play this episode, I will lead in with your introduction when we introduced you as a full-time surfer for the first time. That lasted for a couple of months, and then we completely wore you out. I guess that is true. I think it was the event schedule at ASLD that did you in. But we've all come a long way in 3 years, hey?
We have. So I am so excited about the opportunity to wish Surfing the NASH Tsunami and you third birthday to last to the 3-year mark is no small feat, particularly as this field of NASH has changed, hepatology has changed, podcasting and how people consume media has changed, and to successfully navigate that in perpetual growth mode is really something to be applauded and recognized. So I thank you for giving us the opportunity to do so.
Thank you for that. That's very kind of you to say. I kind of feel like we've been drinking out of a fire hose for 3 years. The only difference is that there's more water going into the house all the time, but my face gets splashed harder every week, but it's a good thing. I'm happy with that. So we were talking about this yesterday with Stephen on the main episode. When you first came on with us, it was International NASH Day 2020. And that was about the time that Intercept got their CRL on OCA, which was in no particular order a really down day for everybody in Nashville, and led to one of the fascinating episodes in the history of our podcast with, as I noted yesterday, a guest that you recommended.
Blame it on me.
Blame it on me. I accepted it and I drove the discussion.
It's good entertainment, though. One of the things that is so important, I think, when we look back on the annals of NASH and how this field and this movement began, the adding of your voice and expertise, the adding of this podcast to the mix in the ecosystem will be seen as a very important catalyst, a very important element of what I believe will ultimately be a very successful field. And that's because you bring so many things, but a background in understanding the business, the market research, the industry side to this, to balance the science. I think that's also where perhaps a little unexpectedly I was able to add value as well. Certainly I bring the patient voice and experience, but I am also very steeped in the business of healthcare, the incentives of healthcare, the motivations of different stakeholders in healthcare. The two of us have really worked in a very complementary fashion to anchor the community, both at its high points and its low points, in the realities of what it actually takes to get a therapy approved, what it actually takes to get a therapy adopted. And we've been sort of very, for the most part, politely, certainly on your end, very politely and thoughtfully. Sometimes I'm a little passionate, keeping them reality-based.
I think that's fair. One of the benefits I think we both brought at that particular moment was for me to say this might not be a bad thing, And not because it was a good thing, but and frankly, I think it's turned out okay. Look, I said this a whole bunch of times. I think had that drug gotten approved, commercial development would all be around what do you do after an FXR, and that wouldn't be nearly as helpful as what we had to go through. Now, my people spent 40 years in the desert after the Pharaoh set us free. So I understand what it's like to wander around without knowing exactly where you're going to wind up. The sea has not parted yet, but we're hoping to see that event later this year, right?
Right. And if we could avoid idolizing the golden calf, we could arrive there sooner. So I think you're absolutely right. If we keep focused on the right things, then our path can be a little straighter.
In that one, though, I think you and GLI have been amazingly valuable. I was listening to some old stuff to get ready for this, and the first time you came on here and said nothing about us without us, I don't think anyone would even consider that anymore.
And, in all fairness to the field before, there are many things that other entities, whether corporate or physician or researchers, would have had to do if there were not a GLI, if there were not effective advocacy in the space, if we had not come in and built the NASH Council to be a home and a hub and a neutral platform for medical societies and patients and industry and an expanded group of advocacy organizations from sports to endocrinology, and really put that framework together, it would have been understandable why the patient voice could have been discounted. We had to do our due diligence to collect ourselves and to train ourselves to be effective partners in that seat at the table. Since we have more than done that, yes, now there is no excuse but to have the patient voice involved. And not just a voice, as I said to a group of advocates yesterday about my experiences at my first FDA as a member of the advisory committee itself, having a vote is even better than having a voice. So having an active role in the formation of all of these elements of NASH, whether that's in the guidelines or the nomenclature or research protocols, having that active participation by patients is for everyone's benefit, certainly first and foremost the patient, but the research is made better. The industry partners are made better for that input and engagement, and we're really happy to be able to provide that.
I think that's fair. I have two thoughts about that. Number one is that a significant amount of that is due to the active engagement of patients who were mistreated or mishandled by the system in the early days of their NASH, but buttressed by you who I don't think of you as a NASH patient, I certainly think of you as a liver patient, and that whole breadth of experience, everything from CNN Crossfire over to FDA advisory, over to law degree, over to PR, over to 27-year transplant survivor?
28.
28?
Yeah.
Okay, and counting. That's a lot. So, hi there.
Hello.
So, Louise has joined us. So, everything that you brought, I think all that was necessary at different moments. And frankly, and your ability to change key, to be positive, affirmative, virtually gentle at moments.
Did you list those moments for me?
And significantly more strident at other moments.
Thank you for all of that. And yes, it's true. I am quite unique, and the field is lucky to have me. I feel
We're going to take out the ha when we edit this tape, Donna, so it sounds like a complete I am the goddess moment.
To be fair, Roger, she is.
I do feel that I was called for a purpose, that the pain that I experienced in my journey is for a reason. It matters because I can transform it into change for others and improving the system for others. I am really grateful for all these different parts of my background and experience that I can bring on behalf of liver patients and on behalf of the field of hepatology and of NASH. Certainly as a person who is living with several chronic illnesses, I do wish maybe all of those skills weren't needed. and I'm looking forward to certainly, as Team GLI is growing and taking on more and more of that, but so are other liver advocates that we've been able to incubate. And some is the field as it is evolving, and some, as healthcare as it realizes how it needs to be more authentically patient-centered and what that means in actual execution and what whole person care looked like. There are days and healthcare experiences where I feel, okay, maybe I have been heard. Maybe I can go retire on a beach somewhere at some point. So.
I don't see that in your dance card. I just, you do that for 3 days and then you grab a phone or something. And I know that you're capable of relaxing and retiring, but I also know the level of urgency and the things that you look at. So let's do this. We've come a long way in 3 years. Patients are listened to, right?
Sometimes.
and by the way, sometimes a vote, sometimes a voice, sometimes in the room, but not necessarily, and even getting to speak, but not necessarily being heard. Let's go to the mountaintop and look 3 years out. What does this world look like at that moment?
3 years out, 3 years from now, we will have multiple NASH medications approved. We will have prioritized non-invasive diagnostics. And by that, I mean, there'll be a clearer order and preference and use case for a handful rather than a multitude. I think AI will be more firmly embedded and useful. We will have a better method from a community and health system process standpoint of identifying patients and putting them into care. Louise's program will be, worldwide. And we will have liver health centers, and NASH is really the essential element of enabling those to happen because of its connections to metabolic health, its connections on the other side to cancer, its connections to things that people understand and care about. NASH really will be the thing that allows us to break through and create liver health centers that are able to work across, prevention to very advanced stages of disease. I think it will happen just that quickly because we have all the elements. Now we just need a few essential catalysts, the first and second approvals being just some of those sparks.
It's interesting. The famous baseball philosopher Yogi Berra once said, when you get to a fork in the road, take it. But I can actually see this road going in two forks and us taking both of them at once. One is the one you just described, which is liver health as a focus in its own right. And the other is the conversation we were having with Amy Articolo this morning and have had several times, which is it feels to me as if everything is folding in on itself, right? Diabetes, obesity, lots of things that are about insulin resistance, a lot of things that are about metabolic health. Recognizing the central position of the liver and then the essential nature of needing primary care to help us spot it, because hepatology isn't going to cover enough patients by themselves, will move us towards liver health. It will also move us towards understanding the centrality of liver in that entire scheme of diseases and maybe allow us to think about all patient health a lot differently.
Absolutely.
I'm not quoting Amy chapter and verse this morning, but I'm always saying this morning, NITs become so important. Although Amy was the one we were on the podcast with when we decided we're just going to call them tests.
Yes, I think that's right.
Because they're only non-invasive in the context of biopsy. But blood-based biopsy and machine-based scans and things like that will enable us to figure out for different patients, what do we need to do first?
We need to do this at scale. So to do that at scale, it can't be based on biopsies and it can't be based on hospitals. It has to be brought out to where people are in the context of their lives. And so we need to be able to do this at community health fairs and baseball games. And, we just need to be able to do this at homeless shelters and federally qualified health centers and, maybe outside the supermarket, so it just needs to come out of the clinic and into people's lives in the same way that the awareness of it needs to come out of sort of a rarefied elite academic space and needs to be in airports and on episodes of Grey's Anatomy. We're ready for our close-up.
Donna and I sing off similar hymn sheets, but I think what I'm most struck by with Amy's conversation this morning, also Donna, and particularly the work that Donna does, you have a famous president called Benjamin Franklin. There's a very famous saying of his, and it sums up where we go from medicine through to patient advocacy, I think. If we look at purely physician-led, we go tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember. Now that's the nurses, allied healthcare professionals who spend a little bit more time in the front line. So that's why patients then get that intervention. And then where the patient advocacy, and particularly strong of GLI, is involve me and I learn. But not only do I learn as a patient, I learn from what GLI have done in the space for NASH and NAFLD and other liver diseases, is that the pharma are now sitting up and learning about how patients can be involved, should be involved, and are now being involved in that program. There isn't another one-liner sentence that basically sums up everything that's happening in the space at the moment and transcending everything, the Benjamin Franklin, I suppose. And it just struck me, the more I'm listening to all of this and being involved in that space, it defines it. And that's what Donna's achieved through GLI and will continue to do, I'm fairly sure. But getting it into the public space, as we know, is the domain that I would like to see it in, and make it local. If you put a fence in the way, like on a Grand National, the bit higher the fence, the more people fall. And the more fences you put in the way, the more the horses fall. And people fall at every fence. So we've got to bring them down. We've got to get it local. We've got to get liver health as a normal conversation. If you've got a healthy liver, you're generally healthy around that liver for the majority.
Cheers to that.
I'll just take this opportunity to say happy third birthday to the Surfing Tsunami podcast. Thank you to Roger for always welcoming the patient voice and not curtailing the types of conversations that we could be involved in. And I want to thank Louise and Stephen and Jörn and everybody else who has been so gracious in sharing the virtual stage, but podcast air space with me and other members of Team GLI and other patient advocates as we work with you across. And we look forward to 3 more years and beyond in whatever your creativity comes up with in terms of the next formats and topics and range that these conversations may take.
Well, thank you. And all that's coming. And then let me just close this portion by thanking Team GLI. I said this recently somewhere. You come out of pharmaceuticals and people talk about patient journey, but it's a very unidimensional view of patient journey. You get this diagnosis, you go to this doctor, blah, 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 blah. What you have done and what your team, and by the way, NASH Knowledge does a fantastic job of this, and Fatty Liver Alliance and some other people, but you've kind of been out front of all this, is making real all the components of the patient journey. It's not just about the patient journey as the patient interacts with doctors or even interacts with nurses. It's about the journey in the patient's life and all the ways that wellness and illness affect that. And that's a vantage point from which I don't think people can ever go back. There are times where you see something, you can never forget that you saw it. It just becomes that flash of the obvious that changes everything. And I think that you guys have created that, Donna. And you're to be commended because, boy, does it matter.
Thank you.
Let's let you go back to what you're doing and take care now. Bye-bye.
Our final special interview is with an important voice who is new to surfing the NASH Tsunami. CEO Frédéric Cren from our sponsor Inventiva Pharma.
We're here with our third and final interview of the birthday celebration with actually someone who's not been on the podcast before, who we're delighted to have with us, Frédéric Cren, CEO of Inventiva Pharma. Good morning, Frédéric. How are you today?
Very good. Good morning, Roger.
Thank you for being our sponsor for this event, and thank you for joining us. And Louise is with us as well. Good morning, Louise.
Yes, good afternoon here. Nice, a pleasure to be here again.
One of the interesting things about this podcast, Frédéric, is that we're always in at least 2 parts of the day, and sometimes we have morning, afternoon, and night all at the same time. With that, do us a favor, just take a moment and tell our audience just a little bit about your background and how you came to be in the position you're in right now.
Yeah, all right. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Inventiva. It's a company we created 10 years ago. I've done the classical CEO work or experience with that, especially in big pharma in different positions. And then at a certain moment, I just decided it was time for me to try to create a company and provide a drug to patients. And that's how we came to develop lanifibranor. And now we are close to the finish line and doing a pivotal phase 3 that hopefully will bring this promising compound to patients.
Very, very exciting. When we first met, I think it was November of 2019, maybe, at AASLD in Boston. I was advising Yasmin Rahimi on some things. At that point in time, you expressed some real confidence that lanifibranor would come to market and would be different from Ella, which was due to come before, but obviously is not going to come to market in NASH. And it's worked out pretty much the way you said so far, hey?
Yeah, good. So I'm still confident. Of course, I meet with a lot of investigators and the team, and, we know the drug works. If you look at the phase 2b data, it was great. It was great on the histology parameters, but also on the metabolic parameters, on the liver enzymes, on, of course, HbA1c. So yes, we have a drug that works with a good tolerability. We just need to conduct this phase 3, get the results, and hopefully we'll be in a position to file and look for accelerated approval.
So what have the last 3 years brought for lanifibranor? 3 years ago, you were just at the beginning of the phase 2 process, and you're much further along now. So what is the company and what have you been doing to move the drug forward in the last 3 years?
Yeah, so it's many things, of course. Of course, we build on the success of Native. If you put yourself back in 2020 when the result came out, this was the first oral drug to show that the compound in 6 months was able to resolve NASH, at the same time also to reduce fibrosis, which are, as you know, the 2 clinical endpoints that are required by FDA and EMA for accelerated or conditional approval. And also we have shown shown that we were also statistically significant on the composite endpoint, so patient with both NASH resolve and one-stage fibrosis reduction. So really a home run. And on top of that, an asset that showed that it was statistically significant on reducing HbA1c, on more or less normalizing liver enzymes, positive on metabolic profile, etc. So all of things that we've been published since then. And then from there, it's a question of meeting with the FDA, agreeing on the design of the phase 3, get breakthrough therapy designation. Once again, there we were, I think, the third compound at that time to get breakthrough in NASH. And then a lot of work to prepare for this phase 3 that now is up and running. We're present in 23 countries, so it's quite incredible for me that I've been in this adventure for the past 10 years to imagine that today a patient in 23 countries in more than 300 clinical trial sites are in the study, are every day taking their oral drugs. I think it's quite a good accomplishment. And all of that in a period of time with COVID where there was a lot of disorganization, so there's been a lot of heavy lifting. And luckily, this is past us, and we're targeting to finish enrollment by the end of the year, which means that we'll have the results, top-line result in the second half of 25. And then, this is the main study. And then in parallel, we're working on a trial with Professor Cusey that I know you know well in patients with type 2 diabetes. This is something we really want to continue to explore because when you look at NASH is competitive, there are several drugs over there with good profile. And certainly something that is unique to us is the fact that we improve insulin sensitivity in patients with type 2 diabetes. And we also have shown that in the phase 2b, patients with pre-diabetes, we stop their progression versus type 2 diabetes. So it's certainly, this insulin sensitivity property, that's something we want to explore, and that will differentiate us from competition. And this study with Professor Cusey will help us to do that. The study is fully enrolled, and we are looking to publish the result very soon because the target is mid-Q2 of this year. So that's one study that is ongoing, and the other study that we also think will be very promising is a combination study of LANI with SGLT2. So although LANI showed very robust efficacy on NASH resolution, fibrosis, and cardiometabolic markers, I think the combination with an SGLT2 and empagliflozin could show additional benefit. We also have patients under GLP-1 in the main phase 3 study, so also there we'll be able to study the combination of LANI plus GLP-1. So, all of this data in combination will be helpful in the life of LANI once it will be on the market.
So, Frédéric, that's quite a lot. Louise, I've got a couple of questions, but let me turn to you first. What would you like to ask Frédéric about this morning?
For me, it all sounds very exciting, and I think I'd be looking more at the side effect profiles, the tolerability for patients. Were there any particular problems that come across in the different groups, for example, diabetes versus just normal NASH patients? Anything that we could pick out that we could look at targeting for education, for patient support, those sort of areas that keep people on drug that is successfully proven to work for them?
So on the side effect, the LANI is well tolerated. We had a very, very low dropout if you look at the phase 2b, and I think this is also something that I think is remarkable about the drug. It's well tolerated. We had some cases of increased weight gain, which is explained due to the mechanism of action where we improve, as I mentioned, insulin sensitivity, and this comes with a mechanism that is well known with PPAR gamma, which is a shift from the visceral fat to the adipose tissue, so from pro-inflammatory visceral fat to less inflammatory fat in the adipose tissue. This is something we've communicated on, and I think we have shown some data that was really, I think, very well received, is the fact that when you look at patients that gain weight with LANI, this comes with improvement in the metabolic profile. So patient will have an improvement in HDL, triglyceride, blood pressure, adiponectin, proBNP, etc. And when you look at patients on placebo that gain weight, it's all the contrary. All of that goes on the wrong direction, and that's explainable because it's a weight gain due to a wrong lifestyle or not enough sport or too much eating the wrong food. And this is totally different with LANI. So it's really this good weight notion, which is well understood by doctors, especially diabetologists, because they know about this consequence, for example, of insulin. And it's something we continue to educate. And it's also one of the reasons why I think this combination trial with SGLT2 or the data we'll be able to generate with GLP-1, I think will help show that if you add an SGLT2 or GLP-1, you manage to control the potential weight gain you have with Lani. Louise, you mentioned education. This is something very important, and we are involved in working with patient association. This is really very important, and they do a tremendous work because they are able to communicate with patients, and we are able to, when possible, to include the feedback from patients. For example, we recently opened a website for the patients that are in the phase 3, and this has been done with the patient association that provided us with the feedback on our patient would look at this website. We have recently improved our design of the phase 3 by taking into account the FDA feedback and how the FDA sees the optimal way to get approval. And when you look at the trial, we think the modification now make the trial more patient appealing. So we have reduced the number of biopsy from 3 to 2. We have reduced the consent from 7 years. So before, a patient had to give its approval for a 7-year trial. So that's certainly quite an engagement. And now it's 72 weeks. So yes, when we can, we really try to work as much as possible with patient association because, they do a tremendous job. And at the end of the day, what motivates us and I know motivates Inventiva is, to provide a drug that will improve the life of these patients.
So, Frédéric, I guess I have two more questions this morning. First, one of the things we find ourselves talking about from time to time on the podcast, including in one of our interviews yesterday, is the idea that payers might not be comfortable having to wait 12 to 18 months to see a 1-level reduction in fibrosis in 25 to 30% of patients to see whether the drug is working. That might not sound like a good bargain, particularly in the U.S. where patients turn over frequently. Stephen Harrison talked last fall on an episode of this podcast, and we talked with Michael Corman last fall about some of the work you've been doing with adiponectin and ALT to sort out more quickly whether patients are succeeding or not. I'm wondering what motivated you to take a look at that issue and whether you are happy with what you're learning so far.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. So if you take, for example, the result from resmetirom, in the phase 3, more or less they have a 20% responder. So you have 8 patients out of 10 that need an additional treatment or another treatment, and that could cause a problem with payers. So yes, we ask ourselves the same question. We are more on the 40% of responder, but that still means that 6 would potentially need a different treatment or to be treated for a longer period of time than what we have measured so far. And that's why we did all this analysis. And there we're lucky because when you look at the drug and you look at if you have a patient and you take a blood sample and after, let's say, 6 months of treatment, you see it's adiponectin increasing, you see it's ALT, AST, GGT that are normalized. You look at HbA1c, you see that it drops. You have all of these easy markers that indicate that the drug is responding. And so, the probability that it's naturally resolved and it's driving down the fibrosis and the fibrosis improvement, it's quite high. So yeah, we're working on this easy biomarker to try to be able to identify patients that are potentially likely to respond to lanifibranor. That would be great for the doctors and then also for the payers.
And of course the patients. Yeah. You make a great point that there are so many different metabolic markers that should all be going in the same direction here, that there are lots of ways to look at it. That's a unique benefit of having PPARs compared to some of the more specifically targeted drugs. The other question, I guess, is so Stephen on the main interview said he was going to be controversial, that he thought that in 3 years there would only be 2 medications approved at that point in time, maybe even 1, but resmetirom and maybe OCA. Do you think you'll make it in 3 years?
It's just about there because we plan to, so as I said, lanifibranor targeting the end of the phase 3 recruitment towards the second half of this year. Then it's 18 months treatment, so we'll have the data in the second half of 25. So, the time to file and get approval will be somewhere in 2026. So we're around the 3 years mentioned by Steve. So I think Steve is positive on our drug. We work with him. I would include Lani as a drug that would make it to the finish line.
So with that, let me thank you for your 15 minutes this morning. This has been a fantastic conversation. I look forward to seeing you in Vienna at the end of June. Frédéric, this has been fantastic. Thanks again for sponsoring. I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye now.
Bye. Bye-bye.
And now for the Season 4, Episode 17 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. In a week where we've learned about the release and distribution of the worst kinds of war crime snuff videos, beheadings of Ukrainian POWs, that we've seen U.S. documents released and then altered to make it look like Russia is doing better and Ukraine worse than is true, and that some major countries have decided it's not in their interests geopolitically to take sides, it is important for us to remember that the world's democracies must support each other in all appropriate ways if democracy is to thrive as a continuing worldwide experiment and experience in the best form of government. And to remember that this war goes on. Slava Ukraini. Now, a long episode doesn't need a long business report, so I'll keep this fairly brief.
Thank you, birthday celebration sponsors.
I appreciate all the different kinds of support we get from this industry. I do want to pay special attention today to thanking the first 3 sponsors of our birthday celebration, Madrigal, Novo, Nordisk, and Inventiva. One theme of this podcast relates to the explosion of insights, data, and perspectives toward not only approving fatty liver drugs, but actually integrating fatty liver care into mainstream therapy. You know about our Rising Tide podcast for primary care treaters. We have other podcasts, web pages, and information services that we are planning to expand right now and are in the design stage. The contribution that these companies and our other birthday sponsors to come will make will provide the funds that allow us to expand the information products and services we can bring stakeholders. If you work for a drug, diagnostic, or device manufacturer, want to see this podcast thrive, and help us expand our offerings, please reach out. Just send me a note at roger.green@surfingnash.com.
With so much content to share, we thought a vault this week might be too much.
Today's podcast is longer than usual, partly because the conversation with our 4 most important surfer hosts lasted over an hour, and partly because of our interviews with Donna, Amy, and Frédéric. As a result, we have more than enough material for conversations without going into the vault, so we're not going to do one. In fact, you may see 7 or 8 items from us over the weekend. So with that, I'm off for another week. Or should I say, to begin another year of podcasting. Both are true. Thanks to Jake, Magic Mike, Steve, Eric for helping us get this episode out the door. Thanks to Stephen, Jörn, and Louise for being surfers along with me, and for everything you've done to help us get this podcast to this point. Next week's episode was based on the release of a document that hasn't come out yet, so we're still sorting out which episode concept to move forward. Trust me, though, it will be interesting and challenging. You'll enjoy it. Until then, make sure to let us know how you feel about Rising Tide. Don't forget to send reviews. Stay safe. Surf on. We'll see you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.